We will have Sotiris Dimitriadis and Eleni E.Kallimopoulou. They are both coming from the University of Macedonia. Sotiris is a historian of the late Ottoman period, and Eleni is an ethnomusicologist. And they will attempt to present us with overlapping histories of an Ottoman church or a Byzantine mosque, monumental space, religious rituals, and dominant ideology in Haghia Sophia of Thessaloniki before and after 1912.
I would like to start, as is customary, with thanking the organizers for their invitation and for organizing this very interesting, very high-standard conference. And I will continue with another tradition, a vignette. So, French architect Marcel Letourneau arrived at the Ottoman port city of Thessaloniki in 1906, thanks to a generous stipend from the Mission Laïque. The young architect aimed to catalog and publish on the city's rich Byzantine architectural heritage. Among the monuments he planned to visit was the domed Basilica of Hagia Sophia. Built originally by the Byzantines in the 8th century, the building was converted into a mosque in the 16th century, about 100 years after Thessaloniki's conquest by the Ottomans. Unfortunately for Letourneau, the mosque had been badly damaged by fire in 1890, and by the time of his visit 15 years later, it was still laying in ruins. In his recollection of his stay in the city, the Frenchman described how he asked for permission to enter the site, and after waiting for about a week for someone to produce a key, could finally enter. Once inside, Letourneau noticed that the fire had burned the plaster of the walls, so that the Byzantine mosaics concealed beneath were partially visible. Letourneau began pulling down sheets of plaster himself before getting a better sense of his situation and deciding to approach the Ottoman authorities with the news, laying the foundation, as we'll see, of an ambitious project of restoration. So, Letourneau's act of pulling down sheets of plaster to uncover the Byzantine mosaics reminds us of the multi-temporality of material culture in Thessaloniki and elsewhere. Like all material things, buildings both endure in time and incorporate different times. As Yannis Hamilakis notes, they are composed of all the moments and instances, quote, in which they became the center of sensorial attention and acted as participants in corporeal engagements and interactions, end of quote. In this paper, we explore the overlapping histories of Hagia Sophia Church, Hagia Sophia Jami, a Byzantine building turned into a mosque in the Ottoman period and subsequently reconverted into a Greek Orthodox church after 1912. We're interested in highlighting how the different parts of the building were selectively evoked during the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Greek state, and how both state actors projected their respective state-building activities upon the monument itself. Attention to religious buildings and the change of usages over time, we argue, reveals the intricate web of interrelations among a city as Thessaloniki's communities, and it also suggests that monumental space and religious ritual can be instrumental in the articulation and implementation of state ideology. We will start with some information on the history of the building itself. So Hagia Sophia was first built in the mid-8th century in a crossing square form with a large dome dominating the nave. After the city's conquest by the Ottomans, the building initially remained under the control of a diminished local Christian congregation and possibly served as the city's cathedral. This changed in 1526 when Makbul Ibrahim Pasha, then governor of Ottoman Rumelia, converted it into a mosque. As happened with other former Byzantine churches in the city and indeed the empire, the conversion process entailed little structural changes to the original building. So a mihrab was added to the nave, Christian iconography, as we saw, was plastered over, and pulpits were installed for the imam and the muezzin inside the building. And of course, there were additions of a minaret, and in various phases, either to the left or the right of the facade, and the installation of a colonnaded portico, the Sonje Mahales, in front of the old narthex. So Makbul Ibrahim Pasha named his new mosque after himself, though the name Hagia Sophia in Ottoman Turkish seems to have persisted both in popular parlance and in written sources, and placed it under the care of his own pious foundation, his Waqf, which he endowed with numerous properties in the city itself. In any case, the appropriation of a major Christian site was both meant as a symbol of Ottoman Islamic dominance, as well as means of further integrating Thessaloniki into the Ottoman Empire and transforming it into an Ottoman cityscape, and in the case of Minaret, soundscape as well. Excuse me. On the story of the mosque, of Hagia Sophia Mosque, Etemeldem publishing on the story of Ottoman antiquarianism in Thessaloniki has a very nice vignette from the mosque's history, which I cut off for reasons of time, a decision, and I regret, but we can come to that in the Q&A. So, in any case, the role of Hagia Sophia as a major site for Thessaloniki's Muslim community was dramatically interrupted in September 1890, when the city was badly damaged in a huge fire. So entire neighborhoods were burned down, thousands were left homeless, and a number of public buildings were destroyed or damaged. These included the Greek Orthodox Cathedral, several synagogues, and the Hagia Sophia Mosque, which was severely damaged. A preliminary report from the September 1890 on the necessary reconstruction works, so the Keshfi Evel Defteri, gives us some idea of the scale of damage suffered by the building. So the wooden components, including frames of doors and windows, and the roof that had surrounded and partially obscured the cupola, as well as the minaret steep, were completely destroyed. And even though most of the walls and columns were made of stone and marble, the intense heat and the rubble, the wooden rubble, had also damaged them as well. So parts of the apse, including the mihrab, had completely collapsed, and the portico was badly damaged as well. Walls and stairs were split with cracks from the heat, and the decorative plaster and reliefs had fallen off the walls. To make things worse, rubble from the mosque and nearby buildings was unceremoniously piled in the building's courtyard, where it waited to be carried away and disposed of. In the 15 years that followed the fire, Thessaloniki witnessed a great deal of construction, including a number of ambitious infrastructure projects, several major public buildings, and a number of religious institutions and constructions, including the Hamidiyeh, so-called Yeni Mosque, of 1904. Nonetheless, despite repeated requests by the Ministry of Pious Foundations to the central government, the ministry was responsible for all Muslim endowments and religious buildings, no repairs were carried out on Hagia Sophia itself. In fact, the first systematic intervention in the site was connected not to the restoration of the mosque, but to the general reconstruction taking place in the immediate era. In June 1892, workers digging for the construction of an apartment building belonging to local Jewish entrepreneur Raphael Mosseri accidentally discovered a small set of subterranean rooms that were discovered to form a Christian catacomb. The discovery of the catacombs, later attributed to John the Baptist, galvanized the city's Greek Orthodox public, who petitioned the central and provincial governments, protesting the quote-unquote scandal of a Jew privately owning a site of religious significance to their own community. The dispute was finally resolved by the municipality expropriating the plot, which was then given over to the endowment harem of Hagia Sophia, a return to a status quo apparently amenable to the petitioners. And the Ottoman government also took pain to conduct a survey of the site by local school teachers acting as on-site archaeologists and recording their findings to the Musée Humayun. So Letourneau's arrival and his quote-unquote discovery of the mosaics seems to have spurred the Ottoman authorities into action. Hilmi Pasha, then Inspector General of Ottoman Macedonia, pledged a budget of 32,000 francs with the aim of restoring both the mosque and its mosaics. And he also contracted Letourneau as a consultant in the project. A further assessment of the costs in September 1906 placed the necessary funds for reconstruction at almost 4 times that amount. Responsibility for the project ultimately lay with Ethem Bey, chief architect at the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul, and work in the project continued until May 1911, when the building reopened on the occasion of Sultan Mehmed V's visit to the town. So interestingly, Hagia Sophia served as the Sultan's Selamlik Mosque, or his Friday prayer mosque, and the repaired mosaics were respectfully hidden behind white curtains for the occasion. His research having attracted the interest of the famed French Byzantinologist Charles Dille, Letourneau published his findings in 1911, politely distancing himself from the overzealous Ottoman restoration initiatives, and perhaps this had something to do with Thessaloniki's Greek press taking issue with some of the structural changes in the building and putting the blame onto Letourneau. So.
So after the incorporation of Thessaloniki to the Greek state, the ceremonial purification of churches that had been turned into Ottoman mosques marked the return to the Orthodox Church and the rehousing of the liturgical scentscape of Christian worship. This transition was consolidated by a series of changes in the interior and exterior of the church buildings. The pictures taken by Auguste Léon in 1918, 5 years after the consecration of Hagia Sophia by the Metropolitan of Thessaloniki in June 1913, offer a glimpse of the progress in the modification of the church interior. The mahfil and minbar, these are structures, Ottoman structures, which were put within the interior of the church for the Muslim ceremony. So these basic structures have been removed. And we now see a low iconostasis, a light bishop's throne, 2 plain psalteria, the special places reserved for the cantors, and also rugs covering the floor, short bronze columns indicating the passage to the sanctuary, a few scattered chairs, 2 large candelabra in front of the icons, and fine crystal chandeliers, all indicating the priority that the ecclesiastical authorities gave to the liturgical needs rather than the display of the monumental character of the building a few years earlier. In the church exterior, the removal of the structures that had been added by the Ottoman administration was also in progress. This is actually a picture, the one to the right is a picture of Hagia Sophia taken a bit later on. In auditory terms, although the church's ceremonial purification inaugurated the rehousing of the liturgical soundscape of Christian worship, this hardly signaled a return to the past. The meanings of the Christian Orthodox soundscape were changing as it increasingly resonated with the sounds of the Greek nation. Accounts in the Greek daily and periodical press, such as the one that follows, convey well aspects of this shift in the liturgical sensorial regime. The column Ecclesiastical Chronicles in the first issue of the ecclesiastical journal Grigorios Palamas details the liturgical service of the Matins of Holy Saturday, which took place on the evening of Good Friday 1917 in Hagia Sophia. The magnificent in quotes, epitaphios procession started from the church of Haghia Sophia and went all the way to the White Tower before returning to the church through central streets of the city. The clerics were accompanied by Greek and foreign officials and thousands of people, with chanting and military music forming the oral backdrop. During the celebration of the resurrection of Christ, η τελετή της Ανάστασης, 2 days later, on Easter Sunday, quote, the military music band saluted the resurrected Christ with the national anthem, while the church bells broke the tranquility of the night to announce to the city the Lord's resurrection, unquote. In his address to the congregation, the Metropolitan likened the resurrection of Christ to that of the nation, and after the greeting, Christ is risen, Christos is risen, Christos Anesti, he called on the congregation to pray God to bless the sacred struggle of the nation and support its leaders. Quote, long live the nation, long live the army, long live the interim government, unquote. It seems that such public ceremonies, by blending religious ritual with the pomp of state power, affirmed the alliance between religious and secular authorities in a sensory and affective way, much like had happened with Mehmed when he visited Thessaloniki and performed the Selamlik in the same religious building a few years ago. All this was taking place in the turbulent 1910s. 5 years after the incorporation of the city to the Greek state, with the Allied army of the Orient entrenched around Thessaloniki and an interim government, the one that the Metropolitan had saluted during the ceremony, set up in the city and headed by Eleftherios Venizelos with the support of Entente, effectively splitting Greece into two entities. A few months after the Easter of 1917, and some 30 years after the fire that Sotiris mentioned, which had severely damaged Haghia Sophia, another great fire would ensue, which would redefine the city in terms of human geography and urban design. A few years later, the arrival of the Christian refugee populations who were expelled from Asia Minor in compliance with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, following the Greek-Turkish War, served to further consolidate the sensorial flows between the Church and the Greek nation. To the liturgical services taking place in Haghia Sophia were now added official services to commemorate the victims of war. The Metropolitan speeches, reproduced in the daily press, were emotionally charged and adopted a distinctly irredentist rhetoric. In this way, the sounds of the liturgy and of bells became closely interwoven with the national program and the recent history of Asia Minor Hellenism. To sum up, after the annexation of Thessaloniki to the Greek state, religious ceremonies contributed to the imposition of the Greek Orthodox community in public space. At the same time, they marked the transition from the late Ottoman Rum millet to a religious community defined increasingly on national terms, and were instrumental in the gradual redefinition of the community. In sensory terms, a new sensorial assemblage was formed, involving bells and cannon firing, religious hymns and irredentist rhetoric, incense, candles, military music bands, and bodily movement in the streets of the city. The arrival of the Greek Orthodox refugees was accompanied by the departure of the Muslim community of Thessaloniki, whose decreasing presence in the city's public space had already commenced in 1912, with the return of the Byzantine churches to the Christian community. In the Ottoman period, the convergence of most of the grand Byzantine churches into mosques had transformed the religious topography of the city, as Sotiris already mentioned, and confirmed the supremacy of Islam in the Ottoman society. The series of egalitarian reforms that Mr. Kolonas mentioned earlier on, the Tanzimat reforms that the Ottoman state introduced in the 19th century, abolished the strict restrictions that had applied to church building and the public display of Christian symbols, making the Christian community more visible and audible in public space. In 1925, the destruction of the 26 minarets of the city, including the one of Haghia Sophia, marked symbolically the obliteration of the city's Muslim past from public space. By then, the Muslim community had already departed. Thank you.